We can start right now. Dobar dan.
Good morning and good evening. I'm Natasa Todorovic from the Red Cross of Serbia, and I've said all this so you can know where people are coming from to this meeting. If we have the Australian embassy soon, we are going to have people from across the planet coming to the meeting. So what we're doing today is not only prevention of violence on older women in Serbia. Considering the vastness of the interest, this is prevention of violence on older women throughout the world, because this type of violence is not very well known. I would like to ask now the General Secretary of the Red Cross of Serbia to open the conference. Thank you, Natasha, Your Excellency, esteemed Ms. Norcic, esteemed Ms. Jankovic, esteemed Mr. Massotti, dear colleagues, experts, representatives of institutions, partners, and the media. It is my exceptional honor and pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Red Cross of Serbia. This conference, again, confirms that violence over older women is a phenomenon that we should get to talk about more, especially in terms of the demographic aging and feminization of aging, so we can enable older women live with dignity, with no discrimination and violence. Today we are going to present a survey that had a goal of presenting the characteristics and consequences of gender-based violence over older women and the degree where they are turning to various institutions and organizations to protect them from violence, and how the system replies to these needs. The analysis relates to older women in Serbia, 65 plus, but it also tries to get a view of specific experiences in accessing the protection system of various groups of women of this age, depending on their location, education, socioeconomic station, disability, or other characteristics that could lessen or enlarge the risks of violence, and also to analyze their approach to services of protection. Empowering older women, preventing violence through challenging social norms in Serbia and Austria, which was financially supported by the EU and the Austrian Development Agency, and without their support we would not be able to implement this survey and contribute to understanding and preventing violence over older women. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all women who participated in our focus group discussions. We would like to thank them for their courage to step out and speak out about violence against older women, and their advice that the surveyors used as inspiration to write recommendations for decision makers. These women of all ages have enabled violence over older women to become more visible. We owe thanks to professionals from social work centers who participated in the interviews, and the employees and volunteers of the Red Cross who shared their experiences about violence over older women and the problems that they are facing countering this violence. Also, they shared some good practice examples and their recommendations how to improve the systemic response to violence over older women. A special debt of gratitude is owed to the mission of OSCE in Serbia that enabled us to use their databases from the survey on the safety and the welfare of women in South and Southeast Europe that they implemented in 2018. The data from this survey have enabled us to get insight into how widespread violence over older women is, and also to see some shortcomings and limitations when collecting data on this age group. And also, we owe a debt of gratitude to our partner in this project, the Austrian Red Cross. Thank you.
Mikrofon, ja ne čujem.
I can't hear you. Yes. Thank you, Secretary General. Before I pass the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Nicolae Terotti from the Austrian Embassy, I have the need to share an important note. That is that he represents Austria, that has done a lot in terms of the elderly and aging in Serbia. Owing to the Austrian Red Cross, we were given co-funding for our projects through the Austrian Development Agency. That's one thing. And on the other hand, we were given a wealth of knowledge, skills, and expertise in writing projects by the Austrian Red Cross. So I would like to pass the floor now to His Excellency Ambassador Nicolae Terotti.
Good morning, Mr. Miladinovic and ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid the ambassador, I'm here in my home office, sorry to say, and I think the ambassador is just trying to log in. So if we maybe could not basically wait, I think we should wait for him to get logged in, but maybe we could change the order of speakers so not to take too much time, and then in case he can log in, then he can take the floor, if that is acceptable to you. If anything in terms of technical things doesn't work out, I'll be happy to give the short statement instead of him. But if you accept that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we are okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Zatim idemo
Thank you. So we're going to move to Mateja Štancer-Norčić. And what I have to say now is that the Red Cross of Serbia is precisely because of the EU-funded project has been working for 10 years on projects that are intended for the older population. What's very important is that we were able to open many new issues in terms of aging and access to human rights and violence over older populations, self-help groups, and empowering older women. We actually were able to send an older volunteer from the Red Cross of Serbia into New York, into the United Nations. Based on this strengthening and empowering of older women in our country, I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Norčić to share some thoughts about the EU in this regard. Thank you very much, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored to participate in this conference. I'm having trouble with the sound quality, I'm sorry. So it's very important for me to be here to present the results of this survey, which is based around violence of older women in Serbia, gender equality. I'm sorry, the sound is breaking up. I'm having trouble hearing the lady. So we cannot neglect this problem, because if we neglect it, we will not get results in changing the situation. The issue of violence is the issue of human rights, and the way we handle these issues speaks about us as a society. The European Union has reached several milestones in terms of gender equality, but violence over older women still persists. Almost 2/3 of women believe that violence is common in their community. This type of violence frequently leads. That's why we are all taking responsibility: the judiciary, the police, the social work centers, the health institutions, service providers, and families, friends, and everybody in the community. That is why community violence over women is violence over 1/2 of Serbian population, and the older women who are in the 65 plus group are additionally vulnerable. Violence over them can be included into violence over women and violence over the elderly. And that's why we are faced with the situation that we have a shortage of data. So violence over older women is a phenomenon which is not so visible in Serbia like in other countries. It's not reported enough, and it is mostly hidden from the broad society. All of this contributes to women victims having a very difficult time reporting violence and getting protection. And this is why the European Union, like was said at the beginning, was your best partner and donor in terms of gender equality and violence over women. We are still in your corner. This is why the EU will continue implementing this project in cooperation with the Red Cross of Serbia and Austria, because these positions against older women are deeply rooted in the society, and I do hope that this survey will show the importance of fighting, standing up to violence against women. This is why the society will pay the political price, and we'll understand. We hope we'll understand that the violence over women is costing it too much. So this is important for all of us. This is a duty for all of us. Thank you very much.
Zahvaljujem gospođi.
Thank you, Mrs. Norčić, and I hope that we will continue to cooperate, at least when it comes to us, when we talk about the older persons, because we've made major steps in these 10 years, thanks to the European Union projects. Now we can see that His Excellency Ambassador Nikolaos Todorovic is here with us. Without their support and additional support, we wouldn't have been able to do some of the projects that were intended for our older target audience. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Sorry for, but I had some troubles entering your Zoom video conference. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'll start with extending my appreciation, thanks, and also congratulations for the excellent bilateral cooperation of the Red Cross Serbia and Austria in general, but also in particular throughout these very difficult times of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Red Cross of Serbia has been an important partner for Austria, supporting Serbia in coping with the health-related and social challenges. COVID-19 has affected each and everyone to some extent, but I think the challenges and hardships have certainly not been the same for all people or social groups and strata in our respective countries. The research on this joint Serbian-Austrian project related to older women and violence and supported by the Austrian Development Agency and Austrian Red Cross has started before the pandemic. But I think it is fair to say that elderly people and women in general have been particularly affected in recent months, given the multiple burdens they have to carry as far as family, work and care is concerned, the isolation, disempowerment, and also violence. Violence against elderly people and against women has been, unfortunately, a global and persistent problem. But above all, it is a severe human rights violation. The number of elderly women exposed to any kind of violence in Austria and Serbia is estimated to be higher than 10 to 20%, as we can find it in some empirical research. And this because there has not been enough research in the first place, but also because elderly women in particular feel very much hesitant to report such violence, mostly coming from partners or family members. In order to combat this complex problem, we need strategies and financial resources to protect and provide support to the victims, as well as to find solutions for dealing with the offenders to refrain from violence. And in this endeavor, it is very important that various stakeholders are involved: the legislative, the government, executive branch, the administration, universities, researchers, NGOs from all related areas, as well as media. The Austrian-Serbian cooperation in this case has been successful and has the merit of combining research as well as training and awareness raising. The recommendations that have been issued as a result of this project are very important for the prevention of violence and the abuse and targeting older women. And these recommendations now need swift implementation and above all the support of all stakeholders. So in concluding, I want to thank everybody here in Serbia, in Austria, including the Serbian Commissioner for the Protection of Equality, and everybody else with whom we have worked as embassy very well over the years and have excellent relations. We are really looking forward to the results and the implementation of our continuous cooperation. And above all, I think this is the most important, the improvement of the situation of older women in our societies. Thank you very much, and I hope we will have a successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Ambassador of Austria to Serbia. It is very important that we all work together on the same endeavor. So it turned out that we have more partners within this project, and that's UNFPA. Together with us, John Kennedy Lizotti, the director of UNFPA for Serbia. And everything we are working on when it comes to becoming older and older population, we also get assistance from the Population Fund of the United Nations. So it's not just the number of participants in this conference or the fact that participants come from all over the world, but also the number of partners that are working towards a joint goal, which is the dignity of elderly people in Serbia and around the world. It shows us that we're on the right path to change something. Mr. Musotti, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. Really delighted to be able to join today's event and to be able to add UNFPA's very strong voice in harmony and in oneness of the messages of the little coalition that we're putting together here for the rights of older women. It's such a pleasure for me to be able to be working, and I'm sorry that I don't see Professor Radovanovic, the president of the Red Cross, with whom we've worked before on some other issues but related to older persons. I'm very delighted again to meet Ambassador Luterotti, and I really have to commend Ambassador Luterotti, and especially for his country, because it has been a partner, genuine partner, meaningful partner, especially because I cover more than one country. I know the partnership that we have both in Bosnia and Herzegovina and elsewhere. We have excellent cooperation, and I'm happy to see you here. Ms. Stamjanocic, I think, the European Union, definitely very important, and thank you very much for being here. And of course, my friend Brankic, I cannot forget her, because we have done a lot of things together, and I think we'll continue doing that for a long time. So let me start by congratulating the Red Cross of Serbia, the European Union, and the Austrian government for this great project, where we implemented together with a view to address violence against older people, elder women, particularly on changing social norms, because that is really important. And UNFPA is glad to be able to confirm that this project is really complementary to the work that UNFPA also carries out in Serbia and in the region as well, because we are actually doing the same thing in all the countries that I've just mentioned of the Western Balkans, under the program of demographic resilience. And specific attention to older persons. So this is something that is very close to our hearts. Now, the data has been spoken. My other colleagues have spoken about data, so I do not want to bore you about this. But we have also conducted several analyses that reviewed in details the relevance of the situation of older persons in Serbia, the living conditions and the challenges of the older people, especially in rural areas and in the cities, on violence against older people, on digital inclusion for older people, the impact of COVID-19, and again, some of my previous speakers have spoken about this. And most importantly, the issue of mental health of the caregivers, and with whom we're working very closely with the Red Cross of Serbia. So this wealth of data that has been produced and informing us of our upcoming campaign in which we aim to be able to change perceptions of older people in Serbia and indeed elsewhere. So our aim basically is to be able to communicate with decision makers, and especially the parliament, young persons, older persons themselves, the wider public, and present a human capital, the human capital of older citizens who can actively contribute to the society and enjoy a happy, active, healthy aging. So working very closely with Commissioner Brankica, because she, with her commission, is truly leading the way in terms of articulating the rights of everyone in the society, and particularly now we're talking about older persons, and fine-tuning our message in such a way that hopefully will contribute to the needed shift of perceptions within the society, so that issues of discrimination, ageism, all the other things, that perception of burden to society, and ensuring that we are actually putting older persons and especially women as a valuable asset in the society. The issue of intergenerational cooperation, something that we haven't done so well, that wealth of information that they've got, which we could be able to utilize, we need to be able to harness it appropriately. So UNFPA's second important activity is actually implementing a joint program on aging in Serbia, which is going to be a role model, not just for this region, but the entire Eastern European and Central Asian region, where in the near future, we're going to have a virtual assessment mission in Serbia, which would be able then to inspire the next activities that need to be done in terms of the rights and dignity of older persons, health, social and aspects and related environment. So I just want to be able to reiterate that we want to work with the EU delegation, of course. We want to work with the Red Cross, the Austrian government, HelpAge, the commissioner as well, and all the other interested partners. So if we could be able to join forces together so that we can not only mitigate the sometimes horrible situations that our older persons are in, but also come up with activities and a program that would wholesomely be able to improve the well-being of older persons, especially older women. So, I hope that will be able to be done. So, having in mind that among women in Serbia, aged 65 to 74, 55.4% experience some form of gender-based violence after the age of 15, and 16% of them experienced such violence in the last year alone. So the government of Serbia has prioritized the development of a strategy for preventing and responding to violence against women for the period 21-25. And UNFPA will contribute to the strategy development together with our sister agencies, the United Nations Women, and as well as the UNDP. This study that we present today comes right on time, so it's very appropriate. We'll make sure that relevant information from me finds its place in the new strategy. The strategy, along with the action plan, will present the most valuable framework that will enable us all to deal with the, sometimes the shame that older women feel when they are victims of violence, as well as with the lack of tailor-made support services, which discourages them from speaking out about these problems. At the moment, older women mostly think, if I speak out, my husband, my daughter, my son, my children, or the perpetrators will hurt me even more. We know that violence can happen to women of all ages. 5% of women in Serbia have experienced at least one type of violence at the hands of a partner since the age of 15, as I said before. So enough is enough. We cannot keep on allowing this to go on, and especially for older women. Young women and men need to be able to have access to comprehensive sexuality education, where we have to address the root causes of GBV, talk about healthy relationships, provide information of where we can help. And this is absolutely important. So we need to support jointly the government of Serbia to implement this new strategy. We need also to work actively with the older women. They have to have a voice in how they wish to see how this strategy needs to be implemented, and increase their knowledge about the rights, but also facilitate the access to support services and mobilize civil society to prevent violence against older women. So joint action from our organizations, the European Union, the government of Austria, UNFP, and the Red Cross, together with many other partners, will create conditions for healthy and active aging in Serbia in line with the standards of the European Union member states, a family to which Serbia truly belongs. So thank you very much. And Natasha, really, really grateful that you're handling this matter. Thank you.
Zahvaljujem gospodinu Musotiju.
Thank you, Mr. Musotti. And we will now pass to the Commissioner for Equality, because within all of our projects, we worked together with the Commissioner for Equality. And if you want to launch any initiative, you have to have partners in all the fields. And when it comes to equality, the Commissioner for Equality is a very important partner. This is Mrs. Brankica Jankovic, Commissioner for Equality.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Good afternoon to everybody, all of the dear partners and friends. The topic that we are dealing with here, violence, abuse, and neglect of older citizens, is a special phenomenon and a challenge for the system of protection against violence, not because of deep-seated prejudice and stereotypes about lesser social value of the elderly, but also because of their personal relationship against this inexcusable behavior and their position that they have to listen to others and that they are unable to make independent decisions about their lives. The same reasons lead to discrimination based on age, ageism, which is explicitly defined in our law against discrimination. And lately, what we can see is a sign of encouragement and higher information of primarily to the Red Cross as our decade-long partner, and also other CSOs, where we can see that the elderly are reporting these forms of discrimination, and also especially the cases of multiple discrimination based on age, gender, disability, health, and others, because each individual case which is reported and solved leads to further improving the position of all older population. And discrimination is going to bring about various forms of violence, especially the one over older women, especially gender-based violence. Like Mr. Laterotti said, and I would like to thank him for sharing the data from Austria about the phenomena of violence in the third age. There's not a lot of data around it worldwide and in Serbia. So I would like to thank our partners from the Red Cross of Serbia and Austria for sharing these surveys, because they're very important for us, because they are showing the extent of this violence, and where the society frequently is not aware of this extent, and they're giving us a new light and recommendations that the professionals in the protection system need, because this form of violence calls for special knowledge and skills and also experience. And I don't think that we've had these systemic surveys, in-depth surveys, like we're going to hear in the previous 5 years, ever since I, together with Natasha and our partners from the Red Cross, worked on a survey of violence against the older population, well-kept family secret, which explicitly pointed out that this violence is widespread. And it is particularly pointed to the financial abuse against the elderly, but I'm not going to get into that now. it's important here to say that one of the causes of a higher risk for older populations, women rather than men, is the gender-based differences throughout their lives, not only in their old age, which is why it is needed to continuously undertake various measures to encourage the entire society, especially its women of all ages and categories, bearing in mind the specificities of the elderly, of course, to identify violence and to not be silent about it. And also, I believe this survey will confirm the need to undertake more efficient measures to prevent violence, to further strengthen the system of support to victims, and strengthen institutions that are competent to counter it, and also CSOs that are dealing with it as well. It's important to close by saying that it's very important that Serbia is not an island in this struggle, and it's very important that we have our partners from the EU here, especially Austria today, and I'm glad to see His Excellency Mr. Nicolaos Lautrotti, and also Ms. Shamfernoci, that I know that are personally sensitized and aware of this problem, and of course Mr. Mosotti, our friend and partner from the UNFP, who supported this survey 5 years ago. And I have to tell everybody that this year, together with our partners from UNFP, are going to present a separate report on the position of the elder population in Serbia in the parliament. And we're going to be presenting this major survey there for the first time. But we are going to include this survey that we're going to see in a while, because violence against the older population definitely has a place and needs to be talked about in the parliament. And it's very important is that myself and the institution that I am in charge of is strongly supportive of the European integration. We believe that we should be part of all European policies, including this one, the aging policy. And we're going to get on board the consultation process to develop two various important European documents, Green Paper of Aging and Rural Development, a long-term roadmap. I'm not going to get into the details, but I believe that this Green Book and the roadmap need to be part of the documents that Serbia will consider, and we will issue our recommendations in line with European policies and in line with what we hear today from this survey. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing these results, regardless of how difficult they may be, because the most important thing here is not to shut our eyes before these problems that our societies are facing, because we need to prepare ourselves for the time, as the report on the impact of demographic change says, when the European population from today's 100 million elderly, from about 500 million, so almost 20%, according to certain estimates in 2070, the percentage will be raised to 30%, and that the average lifespan will be 86. So, welcome to our new European age. Thank you, Ms. Jankovic. Let's move on to the survey. Before I pass the floor to Professor Dr. Marija Babovic, I would like to just share the following. This survey and the requirements of the project, this survey has completely exceeded the requirements of the project. We have done more than we've planned. We wanted to do a survey of the legislative framework preventing the violence over the older population. We also wanted to do some focus groups, and we were supposed to do in-depth interviews with social workers and Red Cross staff. Owing to the OSCE mission, we were given a database around safety and well-being of women in general, in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, and we could extract from it some quantitative data on violence against older women. So it is my honor and pleasure to see here Professor Dr. Marija Babovic from SeConS and from the Faculty of Philosophy in Belgrade. Please, Ms. Babovic, take the floor. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to present a portion of our joint findings and our joint research. I'm going to try to share the presentation with you. I hope you can all see it. Like my colleague Todorovic said, we have undertaken a comprehensive analysis. We triangulated data in a way because we had an opportunity of using the findings of this representative first a survey of its kind in the region, which was implemented in fact under OSCE and which was also participated by other international organizations like UN Women, UNFPA, whose director we have with us, and that represented a major source of information on gender-based violence in Serbia at all. This was the first representative survey for Serbia, and it enabled 8 countries in the Southeast Europe region and East Europe region use the same methodology and study based on the distribution and the characteristics of gender-based violence against older women, and gave us the most precise insights into the situation. And the methodology in question was based around the European methodology, EU methodology of the original FRA survey that was in fact enabling for EU countries to compare their situation and to have a survey of the situation in terms of violence against women. This part of the presentation that you're going to hear now relates only to the part of the survey that was prepared by my colleague Biljana Stepanov, or Stepanov, I'm always mispronouncing her last name, I'm sorry, and myself. So it includes 3 important aspects. My colleague Todorovic is going to talk about the qualitative survey and the recommendations which were based around all of these research components. So briefly about the legal framework, especially because we have a broader participation here from people who may not be aware of the actual legislation in force, and then the prevalence of violence against older women in Serbia, and some of the situation in the system, what is the state of the art. And my colleague Stepanov is going to comment on it and answer questions that may arise. So, briefly around the legal framework, what's also good information about Serbia is that for the time being, we have a relatively established legal framework, which is on the one hand relying on some international obligations and the national legislative framework. But what's specific in this case when we talk about gender-based violence over older women is that in fact you can see 2 parallel frameworks. One of them relates to gender-based violence against women, and the other one against the older population, or in this case like the Convention on the Rights of the Persons with Disability, which is increasing with old age and which is frequently represented among older women. So we are in fact keeping track of 2 lines of legal and political frameworks from gender equality. These are some of the most important international conventions that Serbia has ratified and that are obligating it to act. Well, I would like to especially point out the CEDAW Convention and the General Recommendations 19 and 35 on violence against women, and what's most relevant for us in Serbia as the most important regional conference is the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. So these are the international mechanisms that Serbia reports to regularly. We have a very pronounced reporting dynamics in terms of the CEDAW Convention. Our country not only reports in regular cycles, but we have many CSOs that are submitting alternative reports and shadow reports. And this field is very dynamic, both in terms of the state and the civil society, and the other line of international obligations following through from conventions about the older population. We primarily have the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I've already mentioned it. Then the Vienna International Plan of Action on Aging and the Political Declaration, and the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging. Now, these are some crucial international obligations that are trickling down to national obligations. The national framework is being improved, and over the recent years we believe that it was significantly improved from the Constitution guaranteeing the right to gender equality, and then we have the law on the gender equality, and it is not a it is not the best possible law. There are initiatives to amend it. In 2016, there was a new initiative kicking off that the new law needs to be adopted, but that was not successful until now. Also, very importantly, in 2017, there was a law adopted preventing domestic violence, improving the criminal code, and in line with the Convention of the Council of Europe, the Istanbul Convention. We have the law on the ban against discrimination, and then we have a series of laws that are very important for the welfare and protecting the rights of the elderly, the law on social protection. We have the strategy, so some crucial policies preventing and banning discrimination, the strategy on aging, and so on. Now, what we can see proceeds from these simultaneous or complementary legal framework and policies leads in actual practice to the situation that the elderly women as a specific group are not being identified enough in practice. And when we see what the whole system of protection looks like, they are submerged into one category or the other, and this intersection is very important because they are exposed to risks of twofold discrimination according to their age and their gender, so especially based on the specificities of their socioeconomic position, which, as we know from many surveys, is definitely not favorable for older women because of their lower participation in the economy, because of their earliest stages of life, lower income, lower employment. It all points to the fact that older women in Europe, in Serbia, are one of the most vulnerable categories in terms of poverty and social exclusion. So when we take a look at the findings that we have received through this survey that was made possible by OSCE, you can see the rates of violence for various age categories. And then we have the rates of violence that are registering how many women had at least a single experience of this form of violence before, ever since the age of 15. Before the age of 15, it's violence against children, and in the recent 12 months. So in this case, we're looking at the level of the rate of any form of violence, partner, previous, future, current partner, or a person who's not a partner, which can involve anybody, their family members, neighbors, acquaintances, colleagues, and also strangers. This includes all forms of violence. Plus, we are including sexual harassment, and stalking is a very specific form of violence. What first comes to mind is the darkest bar is actually the bar indicating the distribution in the oldest population. We had the possibility of separating several hundreds from the sample in Serbia to get a very solid category, but this category really didn't get into too much detail in the analysis. As soon as you start looking at the specific aspects, this category falls short, and then some of these numbers fall under the threshold of statistic validity. We cannot find out everything that we could, but we were able to get many very useful insights. What you can see is that more than half of the older women who are included in the categories of older population, were exposed to some form of gender-based violence since they were 15. Also, what this graph is saying is that their level of distribution is a little lower than the younger women, especially the youngest women. The fact is that we have to keep in mind these surveys and representative samples, even though they are the most reliable, they're most revealing, rather than, for example, data from the records of various services, but they're still just the tip of the iceberg that we cannot really see fully, because many women, from various reasons, even even in a very protected and safe situation, are not ready to share their experiences with the surveyors. In the older population, we have another factor, and that is the factor that they sort of neglect their experiences, especially if they were a long time ago, if they were young. What we know from various surveys is that younger women are the most vulnerable category because they're the least powerful. Violence comes from the disbalance of power. Young women are the least powerful. They have the highest forms of physical violence, sexual harassment. And what this survey tells us here is not only the fact that older women were less exposed to violence when they were young, but it means that they could have not perceived some of their experiences of violence. We know that only recently, over the recent decades, there's more talk about this, and we know what is included in violence now. There's awareness raising. So it is possible that their earlier experiences are not being reported because of that. They were not identified as violence then. Or time, the distance in time, makes some experiences less referable nowadays.
In any case, with all these methodological limitations, it's clear that this is the bottom line of the prevalence. So the lower value, cutoff value. Many older women have suffered violence. So we have percentages 64.3% total from the age of 15, and you've seen on the right-hand side was the graph in the last 12 months. So here are some specific forms of violence committed by non-partners in women 65 and older. And here we can see that since the age of 15, where the prevalence is always higher, 2.2% of women report having experienced sexual violence, and 8% that they suffered physical violence. In the 12 months preceding the research, relatively small number of older women reported sexual violence, 0.4%, and a little under 2% reported having suffered physical violence in the last 12 months. If we look at exclusively partner violence, so this is again the lighter colored columns are from in the lifetime experience since the age of 15, and the darker red is the experience in the last 12 months preceding the research. So here we can see that 40% of older women reported an experience of partner violence, most commonly psychological violence. 38% of older women report that as an experience, followed by physical in 16% and sexual violence in about 6% of older women. We can see that the prevalence in the last 12 months is lower. And there's something that we've covered with earlier research, it's not just that the prevalence is different, also the forms of violence change during the life cycles of the women. Also perpetrators change, the characteristics of violence change. And the research we have conducted beforehand that my organization SeConS implemented in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, we saw that through the life cycles of the women, there's this circle of violence where as young women, they're usually exposed to family violence from parents, older cousins, older brothers, and so forth. And then they go into the cycles of partner violence during the middle stage of their life. And then at an older stage of their life, they are less exposed to physical violence, but psychological violence and neglect are suffered from partners, and then also children, especially sons, start perpetrating violence over older women. So older women also give us an opportunity to see what it looks like over an entire lifetime, and it's a glum picture that in many women, we've seen more than a half of the older women having suffered any kind of gender-based violence. We see that this violence has been transformed in different forms, in different proportions, in different combinations between physical and psychological and economical violence or neglect. It's a very unfavorable image of the life that these women were able to lead, surrounded by different forms and perpetrators of violence. Consequences of violence are very grave. Here we have another graph from the OSCE research, which shows psychological consequences of violence. We see that the lowest here at the bottom is anxiety, and then followed by depression, loss of self-confidence, difficulty sleeping, feelings of vulnerability, difficulties in establishing relations with others, and panic attacks for a smaller number of women. 28% of older women have had physical consequences of violence, usually scratches or bruises, but some women have suffered more dire physical consequences, but also there are consequences for sexual and reproductive health that we researched in more detail at an earlier stage together with the UNFPA regional office, where it's transpired that a number of women suffer very severe consequences in terms of unwanted pregnancies, miscarriages due to physical violence, sexually transmitted diseases, and so forth. What comes at the end of this glum picture is perhaps the most worrying. When we look at the entire sample, it's about less than 10% of women, and this is something that we've seen before, even though the methodologies were not similar. Less than 10% of women will report any incident of violence. In older women, we found only a single woman, so one woman who reported her experience of violence to the police. We didn't have a sufficient number of cases to analyze what their contact with the services or healthcare services was, or civil society organizations who provide specialized services. We just didn't have enough women who said that they reported. This number is small even in the general sample, but older women specifically are reluctant to report violence. And this should steer our recommendations for the system. At the end, very briefly, the system in Serbia is complex. It has a whole set of institutions, from the police, state prosecutor, courts, a center for social work, and then including healthcare institutions. when it comes to younger persons and the school system, everybody has to react and involve these institutions. And this complex set of institutions is we are trying to regulate it in a more optimal way in terms of harmonizing with the Istanbul Convention to find an adequate response to the violence. In our study and in our report, you can see this in more detail. The system responds by registering, reporting, assessing risk, and imposing measures. And it also acts through support of different types of support, from legal support, healthcare support, social support, and so forth. This is especially provided by non-government organizations. An important characteristic of the system is the multi-sectoral coordination at the local level. So at the local level, we have these multi-sector teams that are there to provide holistic support and protection. What is very indicative and has come out of our analysis is that the system is equal to everybody. It does not recognize older women as a specific type of victim or group of victims of gender-based violence. And in that sense, there are no special protocols. There are no recommendations or skills that the professionals or the system need to reach women. Our research shows that it's more difficult for older women to reach these services than some younger women who have digital competency, who have social networks, and so forth. The system has not been set up to and this actually depends a lot more in practice. You will hear about this from Natasha, from the skills of the person who performs these activities of protection and who work in the system, rather than having the system have certain protocols or rule books that provide for a way to steer attention and provide services for these women. So this is what I wanted to tell you from this research. You can read in more detail in the study itself. And I'm here for your questions and suggestions. Both me and my colleague Bojana Stepanov and our colleagues Todorovic and Rajic, who wrote with this study together with us. Thank you, Professor Babovic, for this part of research. And what Professor Babovic said, you will be able to see this publication. Yes, we have made the publication, and it has a strange name. It's called In Line with everything that Professor Babovic said. It's called On No Man's Land, because violence over older women has not been recognized in either research or theory in violence against women, on one hand, and also violence against older women has not been sufficiently recognized as specific types of violence when it comes to violence to older people in general. So we have a long road ahead of us that we need to walk together. We're not just discussing older women in Serbia. We're discussing many millions of older women around the world that suffer for any form of violence and don't report. Together with us today is Professor Dr. Bojana Matejic, who, together with Professor Bosica Đikanović and together with us, did research on focus groups in several communities in Serbia with women of different generations. And we wanted to see just how women perceive violence against the older persons, and how much solidarity is there between the women of different ages. Professor Matejic, you have the floor. Dear Natasha, hello. Hello to everyone, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure and honor to participate in this online conference. I'd like to greet all the lecturers and all the participants that have joined us here to hear our results. I will be presenting the results of a qualitative analysis, or specifically analysis of discussions of focus groups. And in this research, in addition to myself, I also had the help of my colleague Bosiljka Đukanović, who is with us today, and perhaps she would like to contribute during the discussion at the stage when we have envisaged for this. So I hope you can see the presentation. Natasha, is everything okay? So qualitative stage of our research was implemented from December 2019 to September 2020. We hit the unforeseen circumstances of the state of emergency, but we did overcome these issues. And I'd like to thank all the participants in focus groups who helped us get the best insight possible into some dominant social forms and dominant culturological positions towards older persons in general, but especially towards older women. We also researched the experience of our respondents on the positions tolerated in society and perception of violence and abuse. We had a very detailed preparatory stage for this research where we realized what we already heard in the previous presentations. We realized that the literature on the risk factors when it comes to violence over older women is not nearly as prolific as for other types of violence. And in that sense, we are very happy that we will soon see this publication published for both experts and general public. That will be also published in English, and this will be our modest contribution to this wealth of knowledge. The participants of our focus groups were women of different ages. You can see here on the slide which age categories we had. Guided by the good research practice principles, the first stage included preparing a detailed research protocol and the detailed guideline for forming focus groups, and then also as a method to start discussion, we selected a short case study with a realistic situation that was very illustrative, and it helped us get the focus group participants involved or introduced to the story that we would be using. The qualitative analysis identified several categories and themes relevant to the attitudes towards violence towards older women, as well as dynamics of violence. And these are the three main topics that you have here on the slide. And I will be saying just a few words about each of these topics, taking from this large volume of findings we found. So this first topic is perception of violence, identifying it, naming it, assessing its frequency, assessing the spectrum of experiences, surroundings, and contexts. We saw that the respondents of all ages found it very easy to talk about it and found it easy to give examples, either personal or from their own immediate surroundings, about how different forms of violence towards older women are not an exception, but they're actually quite often present. They were also found it easy to articulate that this is double victimization, both as violence towards women, as gender-based violence, but also violence against an older person, which gave another layer of severity to this phenomenon. The experiences show that it's not an isolated, sporadic event. This is probably something that happened over a long continuum of time, and that those who abuse older women are equally women and men. And these are often very close, persons who are very close to the victims of violence, both romantic partners, so husbands and partners, but also children, children-in-law, or cousins, usually from the husband's family, especially in a situation in which the woman has been left alone with her husband deceased. These are the examples we heard from rural environments. We also looked at the violence women suffered from neighbors, which were usually steered by material interests. Regardless of the sex of the abuser, both the sexes of abusers tended to neglect older persons and underestimate their overall needs, whether these are material needs, emotional needs, cognitive needs, or social needs. And we heard statements of different techniques of abusing power and control. Different forms of violence against older persons usually happen in tandem. We heard this in the discussion as well, especially in situations where we have severe physical violence, which is almost always accompanied by financial and emotional violence. Based on the findings of our focus groups, the most common types of violence that older women were subjected to were psychological violence, economic violence, and neglect, where we see a good overlap with the results of other qualitative research like we've heard before. In the discussions, we often note the severity of psychological and importance of psychological violence. And we have this statement from a respondent that says, psychological violence is a very important and big problem, but it's not recognizable, it's not visible. It's only visible if you have a bruise, if somebody beats you up, or if somebody kills you. That's the only thing that's visible. Participants in focus groups, especially those who were Red Cross volunteers, also listed that they frequently ran into situations in which younger members of the family neglected the needs of their older members of the family. And they also spoke about the reactions or ways of reacting to it, which was quite fatalistic, to accept the situation as something that cannot be changed, with a lot of understanding and with a lot of desire to understand the perpetrator of violence and to forgive the perpetrator of violence. We also saw that the neglect of older persons does not only affect those who live in older persons' households in rural environments, but also often in city and urban environments. Another form of violence that we saw in the qualitative stage as a very frequent form is violence motivated by property that older women possess. And we see a whole set of different tactics that are usually instrumentally implemented to exert pressure on the older person. This is usually to decide on an important life stage, whether what to put in their last will and testament in terms of real estate inheritance or extortion of pension, or removing the older person from the household into the social institution of social care. In addition to these most frequently mentioned types of violence, there's also discrimination of older persons in the system of providing public services, which is an indirect form of violence, which arises out of not respecting the needs of the older persons. And this was especially visible in the population of rural or older women. In addition, we sporadically talked about the information on different types of violence against older persons in institutions of social protection, where we raised the question of the women with disabilities who were especially vulnerable. In any case, we have a very prominent statement that stuck with us from a younger participant in the focus group, who was very illustrative about the importance of the relationship of the caregiver to the older person, saying that prisons and institutions for the care of the older people are the same thing if the person providing care does not show any interest. So that's the quote. The next topic provided an insight into the perception of the social environment into the context of violence. And in that sense, it was very precious to us. We looked at the cultural specificities and dominant social norms that may form attitudes and may also form the reactions of the older women towards violence. Respondents agreed that older persons in general and older women do not get the respect from the society that they should be getting from the society, and that this is the factor that contributed to this the most is their poor economic situation. And it seems that many older persons, unfortunately, projected this attitude of their own lesser value compared to other members of the public, which was then glorified into other social norms. There was a lot of discussion on the current social norms, but we are seeing increasingly a widening gap between the social strata and a huge gap between the wishes of younger people to self-actualize and their financial possibilities to do that, which gives them a sense of hopelessness and can often be a risk factor in terms of violence against an older person in the household. We also talked a lot about the changes in social trends, especially in terms of upbringing for younger people, and we talked about how young persons were now being brought up in a different way than 10 years ago. Then it's inconsistent, that it's too lenient, and that the consequences come back as a boomerang in the later stages of life. Moving on, in all focus groups, women gave statements that the cultural expectations of this of our community is for women to be committed to their children and to their families 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that they should put their personal needs and any other contents in their life, they should subject that to the needs of their families and children. The desire of older women to organize their time and spend their time in different ways were often judged by their immediate people in their immediate environment, and we have quite a few interesting quotes there. And in our community, one of the elementary human rights, the human rights of women to freedom, was usually limited. They were deprived of it, usually at first in a very subtle way, and then as time progressed, more and more openly. We had this in the focus groups as well as our, just like our commissioner Brankica Jankovic said, we have to work on promoting gender equality and overcoming traditional gender roles that are still present in our community. This expected sacrifice that women are expected to make by the society, and that there's only one way, and that this is the only way to be good in treatment of your family, are the reasons why women actually minimize and not talk about what happens to them, because they're trying to preserve not just their own integrity and their reputation and their dignity, but they're also trying to preserve and protect the abuser, because the abuser is usually a person they're close to, and this person would have to be acting in a completely different way. So the question of how women deal with these issues, we usually get the answer, they don't. So there's a complete lack of any kind of substantial reaction, active seeking of assistance, or leaving this spiral of violence. By analyzing our discussions in focus groups, we looked at the circumstances that increase risk, but we also looked at those who are protective in terms of this. And one of these factors that increase risk pertained to the living circumstances. The other pertained to caregivers or those who live in the same household as the older person. And the broader scopes pertained to the social norms and the cultural context. Here you can see some of the mentioned characteristics. In addition, we heard cases where violence perpetrators were active in war during the 90s or at the end of the 90s in Kosovo as army members or paramilitary members. And we also discussed, not so frequently, about how those who are violence perpetrators perhaps as children were severely ill, but the most commonly mentioned characteristic of the violence perpetrators that was a risk factor for older women are living with a person who has a substance abuse problem or alcohol abuse problem. As for protective factors that were also very important to us, what we found as the strongest factor was the intergenerational solidarity and honest understanding of the specific needs and living conditions of older women. And this is certainly a predictor of a high quality of life, joint life, regardless of the material possibilities that the family has at its disposal. On one hand, the older persons frequently provide financial support. They care for their children and their grandchildren for as long as they can, but also as their functional independence decreases, there is a need for the younger members of the family to take over as informal caregivers, sometimes for very long periods of time. So it's a very challenging time for a family where the family shows its strength or its weakness. In the context of violence against older women, we also see intergenerational women's solidarity, and we had very interesting discussions with younger women who encouraged their mothers and grandmothers to leave these predetermined coordinates of what is socially acceptable and the generally accepted narrative of motherhood. We can say that some social norms are slowly changing, and that there is some hints that next generations of these starting with these generations who participated in our younger women focus group, would actually be changing this. We also have very interesting findings on the older Roma women who are not doing quite a lot to improve their position. They're still very fatalistic, but they are actually fighting to change the position of their daughters and daughters-in-law, which we heard from some of our volunteers. In addition to all of this, we also discussed on the role of the healthcare system. I think you'll hear more about this from Natasa in the recommendations. We also talked about the role of the social system, the educational system, that throughout the entire education process should promote positive social values such as solidarity, self-sacrifice, and empathy. And we should be creating a responsible society altogether. So we discussed a lot about the responsible media behavior. An important protective factor is to empower women of all ages and to change the unfavorable social norms and increase awareness of older women on the rights to organize and live their lives, to choose their priorities, to choose the hobbies they want to engage in, to choose persons they want to socialize with, and so care about their own well-being.
This was a short overview of the qualitative survey. We have many more data available. You can read the integrative report on the whole picture. I believe that you gained some insight into the specificities of the issue in our environment, but also that the experiences and perceptions around the violence against the elderly women are universal, and you could identify some similar patterns in your communities. I would like to again greet everybody who's here. Bosilka Đukanovic and I will be available for questions later on. Thank you, Professor Matejic. So we're tight with time. We're pressed for time, and I would now like to speed through my presentation. I would just like to now I need to share my screen. I can't see where's my share screen button. Oh, there it is. All right. So here we go. What's important about this survey is that we weren't only interviewing older women, we were interviewing people who were protecting older women from violence, and we had an in-depth interview, 20 social workers from 10 social work centers and 21 person who was working or volunteering in a Red Cross. So we got an image of what was the situation in terms of violence against older women, and the questionnaire for the in-depth interviews were administered by experts from the Austrian Institute of Conflict Research, and we had practically the same framework for interviews in Austria and Serbia. This part of the survey can be compared, especially in persons who are employed in the Red Cross. What's interesting also is that the Centers for Social Work and Red Cross are faced with violence against older women and violence in general. So the average of their encountering violence is 4 times a month for social work centers, or 30 to 50 times a year. And in the Red Cross, it's not so expressed, it's 3 to 5 times a year. What a person said was that during their lifetime, and this social worker was nearing retirement, she had 500 cases of violence in her professional life. So as for the types of violence, in terms of older women, social workers and employees of the Red Cross and the volunteers are saying that the most frequent is financial violence and neglect. Physical violence and sexual violence is much less pronounced when older women are in question, but partner violence, partner-based, gender-based violence is something that is included in the entire life cycle of older women. They are just getting some different shapes and forms. Similar is for those who are working in the Red Cross, and neglect is also very widespread. What's also important is that the employees of the Red Cross and social work centers have said that they really try to help the older women, especially if they are living in poverty. When we talk about the perpetrators, like this survey has indicated in the focus groups, the perpetrators of violence against the older women are mostly husbands, sons, grandchildren, and also daughters, carers, or neighbors. Of course, we have adopted children as well. In terms of age, people who were working in the Red Cross, they had identical experiences to share, but they also added relatives as perpetrators. In practice, what we need to know is that, like in the focus groups, we got a similar situation here. That the older women report if they were victims of violence. It's because of alcohol or abuse of drugs. But what people in social work centers told us, they have issues even when an older woman reports violence against her. When they see that their son or relative or grandchild will have to be punished for this act, then they retract their charges. They drop their charges and they don't want to react. It's a major issue. How can you fight violence against older women with this? Women who are functionally dependent are under greater risk, and also women who have some mental issues. It's important to say here that we had women up to the age of 75 in our survey. After 75, functional dependence increases. So we didn't get the women who may have been under greater risk of some forms of violence. And also what many surveys are showing is that loneliness and isolation of older women is one of the greater risks of violence against them. When we talk about what are the reasons for violence against older women, it's frequently alcohol abuse or drug abuse, poverty. There was even indications in the quantitative survey, there was an indication that women who live in poverty report violence to a greater extent throughout their life cycles. And we also have the carer stress. What's also important when caregiver stress is concerned is that we did a mental health survey of informal caregivers during the COVID pandemic, and we talked to the older women, and we have seen that there were cases of violence during the COVID lockdown. Women didn't report this because they were afraid if they reported the perpetrator that nobody will care about them, especially if there was a curfew, when they couldn't leave the house. So women would keep silent, remain silent, and they wouldn't report. They are afraid for their own safety. They are afraid if they report violence, that violence is going to increase, and even they're afraid that the system will not be able to protect them. They're afraid that the processes are going to go on for too long, that the perpetrators are going to come back and continue being violent, and they're ashamed because they believe they are to blame for the fact that their own child is perpetrating violence against them. So what will the neighbors say? What will the community say if I report my own child? What's also very relevant is that one of the participants told us when we asked her why she didn't report, she said, I don't report violence because it's hurtful to him and it's hurtful from him. When we're talking about a close relative, emotions are to blame sometimes for the fact that older women don't report violence as often. As for the system, the fact is that very few how the system helps professionals. What we believe is needed is support to professionals, especially psychosocial support, because they're really open and you can see the motivation to protect. This person, but they need additional support in terms of psychosocial support. And what they already also said, the social workers suggested a very important development, and that more education is needed for specific forms of violence against older women, against persons with disabilities, but also some joint educations are needed. Educations are done for social workers, police, the prosecutors. So everybody has their own individual education sessions, and people who are in social work centers believe that maybe all of them who are tasked with protecting need to have joint education sessions to share their experiences, to hear what are the challenges of ones or the others and how these challenges can be faced. When we talk about recommendations, what's most important, what's really relevant, and this survey has indicated that, it is collecting data for women 65 plus, but in good cohorts. Not all 65 plus women are the same. This survey helped us understand that we needed to get data for women over the age of 75, so that we could protect them on the one hand, so that we could create services that will enable their protection on the other hand. Of course, what's also relevant is that we need to have certain surveys for specific forms of violence on older women, like neglect, like financial violence, like self-neglect, because very often nobody's mentioning that, and it's very often in older women. And also abandoning. Abandoning is an extreme form of neglect, but this is something that is happening now, and what we need to take care of. Legislation, of course, our legislation is frequently really good, but what is necessary is that the laws identify older women, and violence against older women needs to be seen as an aggravating circumstance, because their bones are brittle, their health is fragile. Violence can bring about serious harm and even death. We have implementation. What's also important about implementation, when you look at services of how to help older women, we need to increase the assistance services to older women, not only in Serbia but throughout the world. We need, and it's very important, relevant to talk about psychosocial support to older women. Older women, victims of violence, need support. They need to have somebody to talk to. They need education. They need free legal aid. Older women, when there is some free legal aid, they are unaware of it. Then procedures need to be adapted to social and health care institutions, and also what's really relevant and what we must not forget is that we need to invest into preventative programs and projects, preventative services. We need to enable old women to be equal members of society, participate in decision making, participate in designing the services that are relevant for them, and not us telling them what they, older women, need. We need to work with perpetrators through education, through other things. We need to educate informal caregivers who are suffering stress, and if they are not educated enough, they need to be educated to reduce the risk of violence and reduce burnout syndrome. Education. So more education of professionals. But when we look at the global picture, we need a new UN Convention on the Rights of the Elderly, because this will enable that older persons, including older women, to live in dignity. And an independent expert on the human rights of the older population have already opened a call for comments about violence against older women. So what we did today is part of a global campaign, which is going to have the snowball effect. It's going to start small, we hope. It's going to start a small snowball, and we're going to make some changes in the end. I would like to invite all of you to pass on your comments to the independent experts on the rights of the older population on the one hand, and I would like to invite everybody to talk more about older women so that we can all try to protect the rights of older women, because they are mostly our mothers or grandmothers. So thank you for staying with us today and listening to this presentation. The book is out in Serbian. It's going to be out in English as well. What we have to do also is to educate 300 older women on the topic of violence against older women. We need to educate social workers about violence of older women. We need to have a campaign in buses identifying the signs of violence against older women. And ultimately, what we have is a very important campaign, which is going to be in the post offices, a short film on identifying the signs of violence against older women. And the importance of partnership is indicated by that this film was shared by the Commissioner for the Protection Against Discrimination from Australia. So we're going to have an Australian film, and this film will be supported by the Australian Embassy in Serbia. So for those who were outside Serbia, I would like to support you. Give it a go. Give it a shot. We're all on the same path, and we're all aging, and we need to have the same goal, which is dignity in the life of the women of all ages, from girls to older women. Thank you very much. Thank you again. Would anybody have any comments or questions? I hope this was not too broad, because when we start talking about violence against women, we can talk a lot. I never shared that I was a member of the International Network for the Prevention of Violence Against Older People. I'm their representative for Europe. So this is important for me from that side as well, not only from the side of the Red Cross, but also from the International Network side, because this is our joint activity. So, if there are no questions, Brankica Jankovic, the Commissioner, please, Microphone is not on. I don't have a question. I would like to suggest something. I'm a local. Because you're speaking, I don't know who the lady is. I think that her name is pronounced Aiza Saragumova. I think that she raised her hand. You may not see her, but I don't see. But please, Saragumova, yes. No, I don't see her. She raised her hand, and I just wanted to suggest. I was really looking, and wait, we need to tell her. I'll write her a message because you may not see it. Well, it's important for us to have organizations registering from Ukraine, also Tajikistan, and organizations from the UK. And of course, I cannot forget the Centers for Social Work. Social work centers. Let's see if they will speak up. I would like to ask the social work center representatives to send me their names because many people were listening together, to send me their names so they can get points for the license. No, nobody? Yes, Natasha, Ms. Aizhan is raising her hand. She's on the first screen. I see her. Aizhan Starogova. I wrote her. I told her that she needs to begin.
Microphone herself.
Ali ja ne vidim da se uopšte javila.
But I don't see her asking for the floor. Aizhan? You're muted. You need to unmute your microphone.
Thank you so much for everybody. It was so nice to meet you, also for the first time, but I'm very happy. And it is really, I'm very grateful to dear Natasha for the invitation to such an important conference on such an important topic. And I'm the representative of Kyrgyzstan, which is Central Asia, a post-Soviet territory, and we also meet many problems concerning to not meet, but we also have problems with abuse concerning to human rights as in every country, yeah. And I'm an employee of Babushka Adoption Foundation, charitable foundation, and we help poor old people from the beginning of the age 65 and elderly, more elderly, to help them. And very often they are in extremely poor conditions of life. Without children, without their support, and with very hard illnesses. And often they also face abusement, for example, financial abuse, for example, abuse from social workers when, for example, social workers don't there are cases when social workers don't visit them, for example, yeah, and then they come to grandmas and tell, oh, please, I was ill, don't write a complaint about me that I'm a bad social worker. And they agree, this old women to not to report about not good work from the part of the social workers, etc. But still, I just wanted to tell my first question is according to the report, I've learned that that in the old age, both women and men face the abusement of their rights. And my question is then what specific features are there in struggling for especially old women's rights, as according to the report I've seen that both men and women in the old age face such a problem of violence, and what specific moments because, for example, if an old man of 80 or of 75 is facing abusement of his rights and violence, what is the difference between a woman in the same condition, in the same age, and the man in the same condition, for example, disability or mental disease in the same condition? And I just wanted to specify if it is possible.
Pa u principu ne.
Well, in general, there aren't many differences. The situation is very similar with older women and older men. But what exists as a difference is that men will report their own child more often than a woman will. That's one thing. Because there's the feminization of aging, there are much more older women than there are older men. And we've had an example in Serbia where the father was angry against his he was angry of his children because they weren't taking care of him, they weren't helping him out, they were neglecting him in practice, and he left his house to his neighbor who cared for him. So when you tell that to older women, they would mostly say all sorts of things, but the mentality of older women here, we have the traditional patriarchal upbringing. They need to contribute to their family. Even these surveys have shown that they have a higher risk of violence. Older women with patriarchal upbringing are under a higher risk of violence because they believe that women need to listen to their husbands. They are under a higher risk. But when we talk about general terms, it's loneliness, functional dependence, illness, cognitive issues. Situations are the same for both genders, women and men alike. Can I maybe jump in, Natasha, to add something? Just a couple of notes. If we understand violence against women as a phenomenon which is stemming from the in-depth foundation, which is the imbalance of power between women and men in general, then we can see that systematically older women have less power in a series of dimensions, which leads them into higher risk of abuse. They are economically more dependent. Less women in Serbia have their pension, so they are economically dependent from others because we have interruptions in their working years of age. We have interruptions when they were caring for their little children, or maybe they were working in lower paid sectors. There's always a gap, a pay gap. We have many women in the rural Serbia. Women in Serbia are, in a way, helping out in the household, and they're completely dependent on others. Whether they will get any income, whether they will have health insurance, that they're very dependent in those terms. We found that in Bosnia and Herzegovina in a survey, there's the unequal exchange in the economy. The older men, we asked them, who cares for them most? For older men, older women are the biggest caregivers, their wives. In older women, nobody. Maybe the younger generation. And then we will find them, because they live longer. But the exchange of caregiving is unfair. They give more. We asked about the time invested for a week. They spend twice as much time caring for younger family members than they get in return. And as for men, it's the vice versa. They get more care than they give to others within a week. So although age is a basis for discrimination against women and men equally, it's the declining capacities and functionalities, lower incomes, because in Serbia, pension is protecting against poverty. It's a big factor of protecting against poverty. This gender-based violence, this gender specificity of maintaining women in a subjugated position is just the means to maintain this imbalance of power. And it's particularly specific for women. And sometimes you can hear it in the narrative, like telling women that they're not hardworking, that they cannot do anything right around the house, that their contribution is not enough. This psychological abuse is very present among old people, and I have to say that in some cases they make you wonder, how can somebody spend their whole lives in this situation? You have this life that goes by really completely overshadowed by violence, and it's very difficult for some older women. The system needs to have a different approach on this. They cannot reach out to them through a campaign or putting forward a helpline, like for younger women. I'm not saying that younger women don't have problems calling for support, but older women, especially older women in rural areas, have a very difficult time reaching any form of support. Thank you, Maria, for jumping in.
I have can I ask some question?
Yeah.
Or yeah? So thank you so much. It was really very great to know such moments. And concerning two forms of violence against older women, it was indicated neglect. Here I have a question, how to identify that neglect is at one moment is just your own right, neglect, for example, yeah, and in the second moment it is violence against older women, because what I mean, for example, an old grandma asks her granddaughter, for example, why do you date with this guy? I don't like him. I just don't like him because I don't like him. And for example, this grandma, she interferes private life of her granddaughter, and this granddaughter just doesn't answer these questions, and for example, ignores calls of the grandma when she will start to criticize her boyfriend. And for example, she will not answer questions about her private life, just telling no questions. Is it neglect, or maybe in some form it is a neglect, but in other form it is just human rights on private life? And how is it possible to identify whether neglect is violence towards older women, or neglect it is just observation of elementary human rights? If I have expressed myself clearly, I hope that I could do it by this example.
Yeah, I understand. It's actually basically what is the difference between right to privacy of that hypothetical young woman and neglect towards her grandmother. But there is difference, of course. People should draw borders of their privacy. But as far as grandmother depends on her, and she doesn't, if grandmother is functionally dependent, and she depends on, I don't know, going to pharmacy, providing some healthcare, some household work to satisfy her needs, then we can say, of course, that would be neglect. If you completely ignore and you don't answer to the needs of the person, then it's neglect. But of course, right to privacy is something that should be respected. And I'm not psychologist or psychiatrist now. I can't enter that when somebody, because of the right to privacy, goes to neglect others. Probably there are certain cases like that. But what we want to see on the right of on the side of the older women, it is that actually if they have family or social or institutional environment that can respond to their needs. And for women that have experience of violence in the older age, often one of those three or all three do not function well. So they are then actually exposed to some kind of violence or neglect by any of those three, or unfortunately by all three.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Then, hvala svima.
Thank you all, and we hope that it will be useful. The conference will be recorded. We will have a video. Thank you very much, all of you, and have a nice day.
Thank you so much too. Thank you very, very